attako, then bhagavā, the Blessed One, etamatthaṃ viditvā. Here we have this verb viditvā in the absolutive. I put down here the actual present tense is vindati. You don't really have to know that. You can go to the online Pali English dictionary and search this, or other digital Pali dictionaries and search this, and it will direct you here, because this is, at least in the Pali English dictionary, this is numbered amongst the verb forms of this. So it'll come up. And this is to know. So having known. It might, in this absolutive, you can see it's pretty much related to the English word video, which really comes from the Latin word video, to see. And in Greek, this idea of seeing and knowing, they're not really separate. The verb to know, oida, is a perfect form of the verb to see. So they are, in certain languages, related even. So the Buddha, having known etamatthaṃ, this meaning, these have just been put together, they're actually two words like that. Having known this meaning, tāyaṃ velāyaṃ, this is a locative usage of time, and it would mean just what we would think the locative would mean. In that time, or at that time. And notice we've had before, we had the accusative, duration, and then the instrumental, which is similar here to the locative. At that time, let's jump to the verb udānesi. This is third person singular aorist, and it comes from the verb udāneti, and it means to breathe out or to exclaim, to utter. And then there's a direct object of this verb, udānaṃ. So udānaṃ is obviously related to udānesi. And we get this in Pali sometimes, where literally exclaimed an exclamation. Now in English, we don't tend to say that. We might say something like made an exclamation. And this is one of those cases where sometimes people think that a literal translation is the best translation, and I don't know that that's really true. I mean, maybe for some people it is, and maybe if you're trying to study the original text, but in general, this is an example of where if you're going to translate this, we actually have to translate, we have to figure out the meaning and then translate the meaning. It's not just udānaṃ, it's imaṃ udānaṃ. So it is made this exclamation. And that's this part that follows here, which is in verse. Yadā, when have, or maybe have, indeed or certainly, and we'll skip here, this is the subject, dhammā, nominative plural, masculine nominative plural, when phenomena, you might even say dharmas, but phenomena, paṭubhavanti, become manifest or are clear or are visible. Patur is something like obvious, and I don't know that it's related, but it's you could think of the word like when people say patently obvious. I don't know that it's related to the word patently, but you might think of that. So maybe when we can think about this as become manifest or become kind of visible. And then the second line tells us for whom. So all of these words here are in the dative. Brāhmaṇassa, for a Brahmin. Now keep in mind, when the Buddha talks about a Brahmin, he's not talking about an actual hereditary priest who is a priest because of birth. The Buddha in the Dhammapada takes great pains to tell us what a true Brahmin is. He's talking about a true, like we might say, holy person, a spiritual person on the path. And there are two other words describing this Brahmin, and we can actually kind of take them in order. Zealous, Ātāpino. Now this goes back to a word ultimately like tapas, which means heat, but it's like an ascetic practice. And so this is someone who is practicing zealously, or a zealous person, a zealous meditating Brahmin, you know. So the whole thing here, when phenomena become manifest or apparent to, we could say even for the dative, to a Brahmin zealously meditating. Oh, and you know, I did this earlier. This is really Athassa, but Athassa, by the way, parenthetical note, I did this earlier because I think this is my fourth time trying to record this little short video, and it kept turning out horribly. So it got left up there. Then Atha. Now this is another demonstrative pronoun. This time it's in the genitive, but it's the same, has the same form as the dative, and it's this kind of form here. So then his kaṅkhā, his doubts, vapayanti, disappear. And then what kind of doubts? Sabbā, all doubts, all of them. So again, if we were putting this into English, you might say something like, then all of his doubts vanish or disappear. Or you could keep it a little more poetic, then his doubts disappear, every one of them. Yato, because pajānāti, he understands in a deep way, or knows in a deep way. And then what does he know? Sahetudhamma. And actually, this, to me, this has always been a little confusing. So I'll just spend a little time here breaking this down the way I understand this. Really, we would get this, and we're going to talk about this compound in a minute, but just to see why or to make it more clear that it's actually in the accusative case. This is what we would expect just on its own, dhammā. This would be the accusative singular, the object of pajānāti. But it's getting this closing ti. And what that does is it causes the to turn into an n. And then that's not so hard to understand. But the problem is when the modern, or when those who prepare these modern editions put in the quotes, they tend to put it in between this and the n. So it's not immediately apparent that this is accusative. I think they do that because if they put that quotation mark here, you might think, well, why is it an n? So there's probably not a real great solution to that. And this is a much more modern invention anyway. So we just want to regard this as our accusative, our direct object. And then this splits into two parts, sahetu and dhammā. So as the object of pajānāti understands the phenomenon, and then this part of the compound is like a commandaria. It's explaining this part. So it's sort of like an adjective. What kind of phenomenon? The with its cause phenomenon. The sa comes up a lot that way, along with. That came up in one of ours. Like, anyway, I'll put that in the link. I will not risk trying to tax my memory. So that's what happens here. Doubts vanish. Why do they vanish? Because he understands in a very deep way the phenomenon along with its cause. And we might kind of fill out, because this is in the singular, any phenomenon. There are no phenomenon that are not understood. And I would just put a little gloss on this and say that the hetu here is really it's a synonym with paccaya. So the point is that, in my humble estimation, dear listener, we're not talking about someone who understands, for instance, that water is made of hydrogen and oxygen, or that hydrogen is made up of an electron and a proton. Or it's not really at all reductionist like that. If it's reductionist in going back to avidya and knowing that there's this chain of events that leads to a dhammā. But I am honestly, and whenever I say this, I hope it's understood that I mean this sincerely. I really would value other people's insights on this. Part of the reason I do this channel is to hear the lovely and thoughtful comments. I'm astounded at how deeply people look into these matters and live out this life. So that kind of concludes this. There is a ton that can be said, but I will leave it to you, dear listener, to ponder the amazing depths of the Paṭiccasamuppāda. Peace.